Alright guys, and welcome back to Valorant News. Today is a very special day. I have the pleasure of being joined by the CEO of Sentinels at a very opportune moment, Mr. Rob Moore. Rob, how are we doing? I imagine it's been quite the few busy and entertaining days for yourself and the team.
It has been quite an incredible run, right? Like how we got from the beginning of kickoff till now, last year until now, and then over the weekend, with a tough loss to Gen.G, and then the comeback in the grand final was pretty spectacular.
Absolutely. So Rob, those that are listening that aren't so familiar with yourself and your story, love to know a little bit about how you went from Hollywood, from Paramount Pictures, and then somehow ended up in this crazy world that we call esports.
Well, I have three sons who are all very much into video games, and my oldest son took me to the League of Legends World Championship when it was at the Staples Center. I think it was, I want to say it was like Samsung T1 that year. And again, just watching 20,000 people reacting to a competition, like, because I'm a big Laker fan. I grew up in LA, right? So I grew up watching the Lakers. And if you had your back to the floor, it could have been a basketball game you were watching. So to see that level of engagement was pretty amazing. And so myself and my one key partner, Jerry Greenberg, we both had kids in that same age, and we're like, okay, we got to figure out a way to be part of this. And so that's how I kind of got started. And then we ended up buying a League of Legends franchise in a very odd moment. We bought it between the spring and summer splits in 2016. And then just seeing that connection with fans and the excitement of it all. I'm a huge sports fan and loved that dynamic. And then we relaunched in 2018 when we didn't get a franchise in League of Legends, and then really committed to building a brand that could stand apart. And then we made a huge bet on VALORANT when it launched in 2020, and here we are. For my own story, I've been in the movie business most of my life. I worked at Disney for 10 years, worked for a small production company, and then worked for Paramount for 11 years. And seeing some of those same elements of dealing with stars, how to develop a star, and dealing with brands and how to develop a brand. And so wanted to use that combination to accomplish something in esports. And here we are.
Well, it sounds like it's worked rather well, but it's not been easy, It's up and down, this game. And I just wanted to look back at the last couple of years, because in 2021, and let's just look at the Valorant side, team was great. Win Reykjavik, fantastic. 2022, you guys ascends to new levels from like a clout perspective, shall we say. Shroud comes in and all this stuff that was happening. And I think I remember you saying, like, going into 2023, the plan was to do both, right? Like, we want the success on the server and everything that comes outside of the game. But 2023, that didn't happen. And maybe we're getting there this year, of course. Is there anything you'd change in retrospect, looking back at the way 2023 went?
Well, I think the biggest challenge in 23, right, is I think we all underestimated the work to basically move everyone to LA, get set up in LA, and put a brand new team together, right? And so I'm going to say across the org, in terms of, there was a lot of conversation, you've had a lot of it, about Psycho and his tenure. I think how complicated it was going to be and the time it was going to take, everyone underestimated. And so, like, the challenge of putting together a mixed language roster and adapting players from Brazil into a US team, that combination took so much time, and we hadn't taken the steps to overcome it. And so by the time we got into the regular season in April last year, right now, just the contrast, at that point, we had played 4 official matches right? But what we hadn't done is taken the steps to fill in those gaps and say, okay, because our players can't get their visas until end of the year, what are we going to do to catch up to other teams and prepare? So the good news is, having gone through that last year, we then made a very specific decision to go the opposite direction this year. And so I think the key always in life is you learn from the mistakes you make. And if you don't learn from them, you're going to fail. But the biggest mistakes you make can lead to the biggest successes. And that certainly is what has happened here. Because the amazing part of however bad last year went, we sat down with each player and coach at the end of the year to really talk about 24. And the amazing thing to me was when I asked everyone, well, what is your plan now? Are you going to go take a month off? Everyone's like, no, we want to get to work. This year sucked. And so that's when we came up with the plan to say, okay, you know what? The best teams in the world are coming to LA. They need scrim partners. They want scrim partners who aren't in the tournament. And we can make this the perfect opportunity to trial IGLs. And so at that point, our real plan was just bringing in a new IGL. That Marv always had a vision of returning and playing for Chet with his former Optic teammates. So we always assumed Marv was going to go back and join NRG. So we needed an IGL. So it's like, here's a perfect window. And then as that started to come together, then it's like, oh, wait, there aren't really any tournaments in that fourth quarter of the year to compete in. So that's when we came up with the crazy idea and said, all right, we'll just host our own. We'll just put our own tournament together. We'll do some show matches, but we'll just start competing. And so the only teams that were available, G2, because they had just won Ascension, and then the top tier 2 teams. So like we were scouting those teams because looking for scrim partners. And so talking to Kaplan and Drew and saying, okay, who are the best teams out there? And so I think we were right about where we are. Everyone still agrees now of M80, Oxygen, Moist Shopify are probably the 3 best teams out there. M80 at that point wasn't ready to get back and started. So we brought in Oxygen and Moist Shopify, and then G2, and are like, okay, here's just a way to get going again. And then getting into the Africa tournament, which the interesting conversation is, because League of Legends, there's only Riot sponsored activities. I don't think fans really knew how to process a tournament held by a third party, but including mostly VCT teams, right? There were 6 VCT teams in that tournament, right? It was PaperX, DRX, T1, Liquid, EDG, and us. But for us, it was like, okay, there are 5 teams who just played at Champs. We get a chance to go compete with them at an international stage. So we pushed really hard to get into that tournament based on that field. And then, when people talk about it being off season and what that means, certainly PaperX didn't view it as off season, because if they did, they wouldn't have brought Jing in, right? Like the craziest part of that tournament is we take map 1 of the first match against PaperX. Suddenly Jing's plugging in his keyboard, right? You're like, oh, okay, this is about to get real. So we knew the level the team was at, even though a lot of the people in the community couldn't, right? They were looking at 23, calling it the off season and saying, okay, where are they? But at that point, we really knew how good John was with this team, and that we now again had the ability to compete at the highest level.
Yeah, so I guess just to follow on that point, initially from an esports perspective, I come from a Call of Duty side, very different esport in many ways, although the drama in the North American scene is certainly a parallel. But in that world, and of course you come from a sports background as well, we play a lot of games in sports. And I know that this is a talking point, the fact that you guys have put on your own events, you're talking about playing your first regular season matches in April. I guess from like a business perspective, that's how I see this. Because in the Call of Duty world, a lot of their focus is on kind of like average viewer numbers, or let's say average watch time or something. That's how they kind of gauge their metrics, and that's how they structure the season to have lots of games on weekends. And that's good and bad in some ways. Whereas in Valorant, it just feels like there isn't that much going on. Now, sure, you've got Tier 2, you've got Tier 3 and other games, collegiate stuff. But lots of people, they're just Sentinels fans, or they're just, a fan of another specific team, and they're not necessarily watching all the Tier 2 and the game changes. So it feels to me that there should be a better compromise in play here. But I don't know how that looks for what metrics are valued by Riot and by the organizations.
Well, I think Riot, again, with Valorant, they try to go a different direction than League of Legends, right? And so even like starting with the ability to develop the team capsules, right? Now they're rolling that into League of Legends. And so how to combine those and how to allow third-party tournaments to take place, I don't think even third-party tournament operators had a sense of what that could look like, right? Like Red Bull jumped in quickly and started doing the Red Bull home grounds. They'd already been doing that before VCT, so they just kind of kept rolling with it. But I think that was a big question. And then a lot of the orgs also didn't really view it that way, right? Like people just kind of viewed it as, okay, the season starts in February. That's when we need to have a team together. And so given what we had been through, we were like, no, we need to start competing. Like that was the biggest failing of 2023, is how unprepared we were when the season had already started. And so as we were trying to get teams to our own tournament, people were like, well, we're not going to have a roster until December or January. And we're like, oh, we've been through that. That doesn't usually work that well. And so I think a lot of this is evolving. I think Riot changed the format this year. I think they already announced they're looking to get a better flow next year. But like I said, for us as an org, the opportunity to host your own tournament, we didn't really put a lot of thought into it this year. It was like, okay, we just want to start competing, right? But now that same dynamic of, okay, we have an asset of a tournament, show matches, that viewership that we can monetize, because that obviously got a lot of attention last year also. That here was now an asset for us that we could monetize of hosting a tournament. We literally held it in our office. So we did it on a very responsible basis from a cost standpoint. And so again, building something, as you said, where you can now monetize that viewership.
Yeah, so I guess when you're discussing the roster building, this is always a question that I have with regard to some of the bigger organizations from a content perspective, on how the content side of a player's potential plays into the discussion. I know this is a talking point going into 2023 with TenZ, because he's had, maybe an underwhelming season. So people were saying, I think even Psycho discussed this, that he had to have a conversation with TenZ to try and figure out what his commitments were and these type of things. Whereas for Sentinels and for other organizations, does the content potential of a player play a role in the decision making? If TenZ wasn't a good enough player, would he be gone regardless of what happens outside of the game? And also, when you're signing a new player, is their potential on that side a consideration, or is it all about winning?
Well, I think we talked a little bit earlier about traditional sports, right? That you're selling entertainment, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that is what an organization is selling, is entertainment. So the huge win is that you can find players who have great talent, but are also charismatic and have a fan base, right? So like Lionel Messi is the most popular athlete in the world, not just because he's great at soccer, but also because of his personality, because of the way he approaches the game. So that is the big win in all sports, is how do you find someone with that potential upside? And we saw it with TenZ in Reykjavik, right? Then everything went to hell in 22. The one thing I will say is we take a lot of heat for Shroud, but if you actually go back and look at that LCQ, We lost to the guard in overtime on map 3, who ended up in the finals of the LCQ. We got knocked out in 3 maps against 100 Thieves, who won the LCQ. So he ultimately put on a pretty good performance. It wasn't like he was out there with no capability. He is a seasoned player, as you well know. But as we're then looking to, okay, how do we build this roster? Then the question always is, what is everyone's ability to get back to their peak form? And so that's what we spent a lot of time with the coaches talking through with everybody, of saying, okay, here are the 4 players we have on our roster. What's the possibility for this to be a world championship level team again? And they said TenZ is one of those people who brings that combination of, when he's playing his best, as we saw again, he's one of the best players in the world. But then it comes with the upside of, he's someone that fans love. And so if you can win with someone who has that level of a fan base, that is ultimately the huge win, right? So that is the combination you're always searching for, whether it's my prior life in the movie business or in traditional sports or in esports, is you're always trying to say, how do you win with the most upside? And that is definitely how you win with the most upside.
I think on this topic, we have to discuss Zellsis briefly.
Yes.
Because, in terms of a personality that exemplifies what it is about Sentinels that makes Sentinels a valuable brand, Zellsis is like the perfect character for this. Like, he's a big personality. He wants to win. He's your employee of the month, if not the year. He's got to be up there. But you didn't necessarily see that side of his personality when he was at Cloud9 and version 1 and elsewhere. Was it planned that he would have this much of an influence? Or was it merely like, this guy's going to be a great piece, and then the rest kind of follows a consequence?
Well, no, it was more of the former, because we knew him, because the Shroud LCQ overpowered the fact that Zellsis was with us for that LCQ as well, right? And so we saw in that his passion to win, but also, more than anyone we've dealt with, his desire to both build his own fan base and to help us in any way he could. And so there were activations for that LCQ that Zellsis was like, after the marketing team, saying, hey, what can I do? How can I help you? He does an ad read for Grubhub that we did as part of the LCQ that literally turned into content, because he's so fun and engaging about it. And so we knew that side of his personality, and we really tried to sign him for the 23 season. Basically, Cloud9 and Sentinels, we'd both made deals with version 1. Version 1, to their credit, basically said, okay, if we can agree on a buyout, we'll let Zellsis then decide what he wants to do. And so ultimately, and I think he talked about it publicly at the time, it's all now a little ironic in like looking back at it, is once they signed Yay, he was like, okay, I want to win a world championship. Cloud9's my best opportunity for that. And so, but I think once he was there, he missed the elements of what he could accomplish if he was with Sentinels that he saw. Like, we went through a whole thing with him during the LCQ where we helped him get verified and got his blue check mark for the first time when it was Twitter. And so we knew those pieces. So when we talked to him about coming in to be the 6th man, he approached it with an attitude that few players can have of, that's my role. I'm the 6th man, but at the same time, I'm now going to work with Sentinels. I'm going to build my brand, and I'm going to think about the long term of what that means if I can build my brand and build my stream and build my fan base. And so he was showing up for every practice, every team meeting. Like, he took that as, that's my job. I am the 6th man. And so most players don't have that same level of engagement if they're not starting that he had. And then it just ended up that window of time where it's like the classic dynamic, right? Of Tom Brady only got the job for the Patriots because the starting quarterback got hurt, and then he never gave the job back. And 20 plus years later, he's the best and most successful quarterback in the history of football in America. Um, so so Jordan was ready. I mean, that's always the key, right? Is when that opportunity presents itself that you're ready. And he stepped in. And then I talked a lot about that first match against G2 in the show match. Again, where everyone talks about these off-season events like players aren't putting their competitors, right? You put a camera on a competitor and say compete. Well, they have one ambition, it's to win. No one's looking to lose in front of 50,000, 100,000 people watching the stream. He stepped right in, and then we had that match against G2 that I've spoken a lot about because my content team fed me to the wolves that day because G2 was actually producing that show match, and they didn't hire a caster or have anyone really host it. And we were streaming it on our YouTube channel, and everyone in the chat's like, what the hell, Sentinels? Can't you afford announcers? Where are the casters? So my content team's like, Rob, go in on the chat. So I'm literally in the chat in our YouTube channel getting flamed by the fans going, what the hell? Here we go again.
So
what kind of roster is this you've put together? Is John really up to this challenge? Like, what the hell are you people doing? And we were down 10-2 at the switch. And then we came back and won 13-11, right? Like we then got 11 of the next 12 points. And that was a real moment of change of the attitude of saying, doesn't matter, we're down 10-2, we can still win this. And so that to me was the biggest moment of this whole run, was in that mindset of this group of people, we can win. And so, and you've seen that in all the closeout matches, right? Like map 5 against Gen.G was 5-5, right? We won 13-6, right? Like once it became time to be like, okay, that goal is there, our guys just locked in and then they just ran Gen.G off the stage. That was the most, but that was the way a lot of those matches went in the closeouts, right? Like we went to 5 with Loud in the Americas finals, but in map 5, right, we just kind of ran them over. So that attitude and that connection has been amazing to see. And Zellsis, I now have I've gone back and forth by calling them by their actual names, but for this purpose, let's call them by their game. But that attitude and that energy Zellsis brought was just such a perfect mix with this group of people.
Just a quick one as before we move on. How come nothing ever leaks from your organization? Every other org, if you had an announcement like a Shroud or even like the Curry thing recently, someone would know about it in advance. It seems like there's a good control over the narrative, because I feel like any other org in the world, the Shroud move leaks before it comes along.
Well, a lot of that, and here are things that fans have roasted me about in the past, is being very hands-on. And therefore, like the Shroud thing, there's a couple of key guys who've been with me from day one when I decided to for some reason jump into League of Legends in the middle of the season. And so I've been with them from the beginning, and so we have a great working relationship. And there are some of these things that we'll handle directly. Like we won't bring in outside people. We won't use an outside lawyer. We'll just keep everything really contained. So I was actually, the funny thing about the Shroud story is I was actually reaching out to Loaded to talk about Tarek and signing Tarek. And in the call about Tarek is where we were talking about we needed a 5th for the LCQ. And Yoni Ginsberg, who represents Tarek, threw out, who plays Smokes is Shroud. And we all kind of laugh and we move on to the conversation. And then the next night he DMs me and says, hey, if you guys are interested, Shroud would be down to play. And so I'm literally like sending a note to my guys at midnight saying, what do you think about this? And we all at first are like, are they trolling us? And we're like, but then it was like, okay, we're going to boot camp. Is he ready to go to Dallas for 3 weeks in boot camp? They're like, absolutely. And so we're like, okay. So I just hammered it out with Yoni, signed a term sheet. It's like a 1-page document. And so he and I handled it together. And then we drove out to Shroud's house, shot the video, and released it the next day. And so we moved super quick, right? So part of it also is how many people know something and how long do they know it? That was something from the beginning of it. Like, we literally made the deal like on the 4th of July and then shot it like a couple days later. The best was that we actually were able to get his jersey made so that he actually had his Sentinels jersey with his name on it. So, but yeah, I think that's part of it, is just we have a very small, close-knit group who's been together for a long time now and just work very well together. And so that is how we've managed to make some of these things happen and happen quickly.
Yeah, speaking on Zellsis and also on the handling of these topics, the pANcada situation recently has been very interesting from a couple of angles. I guess one of the angles is nobody really knew fully what was going on. Was Zellsis in? Was Zellsis out? Was pANcada back in? He would joke about it on stream. And I think most people in the community had a feeling as to what the situation actually was. But you guys never made it public until a little while later. And then obviously there's this recent development of allowing pANcada to explore options following quite some drama last year, contract jail, evil geniuses, all this type of stuff. So yeah, I guess speak a little bit on those two pieces.
Sure. I think part of it is, yeah, the pANcada thing has been so hard and so complicated, right? Because the first thing that happened was, right? Now, again, getting back to decisions made last year, right? Because the one thing that happened about 23 was because 22 was so bad, we were like, okay, let's bring in someone who was successful. Let's give them the authority and let's follow their game plan, right? Well, part of that game plan was to have pANcada change roles, right, to theoretically free up Def. Unfortunately, neither of those things really worked out. So pANcada was always kind of behind it. And of the things I would get roasted about by fans, the number of people who would DM me the meme and it would be Messi is playing goal. And they're like, this is you, right? Like, you were playing Messi as goalie. That's how dumb you are. So that was like the 2023 of it all. Then we move into 24, or the 24 season. And like I said, for whatever reasons of health, availability, whatever, Zellsis plays. And now it suddenly clicks. So part of it also was you suddenly saw, oh, right? Because like in any sports team, the 5 most mechanically talented players don't necessarily make the best teammates, right? They don't necessarily bring the best out of each other. That if you just put the 5 best players on a basketball court, they may lose to a team that has role players or people who have a skill set that is different than the other people, right? And so no one else on the team is really vocal. And that is what Zellsis brings to the team that no one else does, right? He is super vocal. You saw it on stage, right? And so suddenly you're like, oh, this group of 5 is going to has the more upside. Part of it then is you're protecting Zellsis, where you don't want the fan base to just go after him and be like, oh, he's not as good, and therefore every move he's making is being second guessed, because like, why is he playing instead of pANcada? And so we just saw that very quickly of how well he helped elevate the team's performance, and that was very clear. So then with pANcada, then it was like, okay, this is the team. This team has now come together. However it came together, it's come together. And like I said, we then went and won in Korea. So then we started talking to him about the potential role, and was he interested to embrace being the 6th man, or would he rather be a starter? His ambition obviously was to be a starter for us. And then saying, okay, that obviously right now, given how well this team is competing, we're just gonna go with this 5. You can start to explore other options. And so I think now there's been a lot of talk about the conversations with Furia. We were not directly involved, but we were very clear to say to him, we're not going to request a buyout. Like, this is no fault of yours that you're in this situation. So we're not going to ask for a buyout because this isn't, like I said, this isn't his fault. So then getting back to your comment about leaking, it was like, okay, now that there's going to be conversations going, it just felt like it was a best time so that also other teams would know he was available if they wanted to pursue him, to just make that announcement to the community that said, we're making him available. There will be no buyout. Because again, like I said, his story with Sentinels is just such an unfortunate one, right? Of he wasn't obviously a native English speaker. He joins a team competing in English. He's asked to change his role, and then he ends up losing his job because of the performance of the team with Zellsis on it. Well, none of those things are his fault. So it didn't feel appropriate for us to basically say, we're not playing you, but we're looking for someone to pay us to take you. So that was how that all evolved.
Yeah, that's totally understandable, and better decision making than many organizations make, I fear. We have to touch, of course, on Madrid because you won the whole thing. I mean, look, when you put this team together, of course, the expectations are high, but did you foresee this level of success with the roster so far? Like, what would have been a satisfactory result coming out of Madrid? Because going in, I mean, after winning the kickoff, the Americas are the strongest region right now. At least it feels that way for the last couple of years, and it's trending that way in terms of international results. So the reality is, if you're the best team in the Americas, you're effectively the favorites to win the international tournaments.
Well, yeah, again, like I said, the thing that's so funny is if people go back and watch, we beat pANcada twice in the Africa tournament, right? We beat DRX, we beat Liquid. Like, we had beat what were the two best teams in Asia Pacific last year. So once we beat NRG, right? Because that was the key match for us. Right, it was one match. You win, you go to Madrid. You don't, you're out. Once we beat NRG in the way we beat them in Map 3, then it was like, okay, we've seen the best teams in Asia Pacific. We've now beaten Leviathan, NRG, and 100 Thieves, who I think the people I feel worse for the kickoff format was 100 Thieves, right? Like, they could easily be the fourth best team in the Americas, but you won't know it because they were in a pool with us and Loud and Leviathan.
NRG might be the second best team in the world.
And NRG could be.
Not,
so
you never know.
Yeah, so like both 100 Thieves and NRG ended up in a situation where it's like, yeah, if the pool had gone differently. Now, I will give Loud credit, right? Because they came out and they had a strategy for our first match, and they kind of stole that from us, but they did. So as we went to Madrid, right, we're now knowing we beat NRG, knowing we beat Loud, and we'd already beaten pANcada and DRX, so we had a sense of. And then I think the key thing, just from that confidence standpoint, is Fnatic getting knocked off, because Fnatic still would bring that shadow of last year. So once Fnatic wasn't coming to the tournament, then absolutely believing we had a great chance of winning the event. I think that combination of factors, because I think the one thing, again, in sports that is always undervalued, and in American football, this is often the case, that when a team goes to the Super Bowl for the first time, if they're playing a team that's been there before, they rarely win that first Super Bowl they go to. And so you saw some of it happen in Madrid, where these younger teams and less experienced players then suddenly didn't have their best performances either on Map 3 or in those big matches. And so even like with Gen.G, that in the grand final, the level of energy they were putting into every round win, right? Like, however frustrating, annoying it was on one hand for them to be jumping out of their seat and trash talking, you can't sustain that level of energy for 5 hours. You just can't. That's just not humanly possible. And you saw it when you got to map 5, because the funny thing is map 1 was 8-8. It wasn't like they ran us off on map 1, but if you were watching their activity, you would have thought we had lost the round 13-2. But in map 5, it was 5-5. So the level of energy they brought in map 1, they couldn't bring in map 5. That's something you have to live through to realize, oh, okay, this could go 5 hours. How do I sustain that? And so we had Saucy and TenZ, who've both won international events. John, who'd been to the final of an international event, and Zellsis and Zekken, who had participated in the international events. So all 5 of our guys had been there before. And so that energy you need, that mental strength you need is complicated. And so that's where that combination of the teams we'd already competed with and that level of experience definitely went to Madrid with a belief that we had a great chance of winning.
How do you balance this pressure between celebrating the victory and understanding that the hardest challenge is yet to come? Because now every team is looking at Sentinels. That's the kings that they're trying to, usurp from the throne, as it were. Is your opinion on this relevant, or is this on Kaplan and Drew Spark and the coaching staff and the players to say, okay, let's enjoy this for a couple of days and then let's go back to work?
Oh, I think, for better or worse, because of us winning the first event ever in 21, because of the attitude that we carry on with our social media, and because our brand is the most popular brand in Valorant, even when we weren't having a great year, everyone came at us with their best match. Like, winning against Sentinels was always what people prioritized. So I don't know that the target could get that much bigger on us, because everyone always wanted to beat Sentinels and celebrate it. But yeah, it's a long season. Basically, the players everyone took this week off. Kaplan actually went to Portugal and relaxed, but everyone basically just kind of checked out for this week and then coming back next week to get ready for the start of the regular season. But I think that has been the target that's been on us since Champs 21.
Absolutely. Okay, the final question that I wanted to run through, Rob, really wasn't long ago, you guys went through the crowdfunding thing, and despite all the successes as an organization, as is very common in esports, the discussion of financial instability, the conversation around the way the league is structured, with the publisher calling the shots and what that means from a revenue split percentage and all these other things, especially given where your organization is compared to from like a content perspective and everything around the strength of the brands in comparison to other organizations that are, struggling to survive. I guess, have you got perspectives on ways that if you could just magically call all the shots and decide how the ecosystem would be structured, that you think would be better for all parties? Because, well, Sentinels is killing it in many respects. My feeling has always been, a rising tide lifts all the ships, and we need probably more sustainability from top to bottom in the esports landscape, because it's still, to me, there's some organizations that can still afford to pay big salaries, and there's some organizations that have to basically pay the bare minimum. In the Call of Duty landscape, the dichotomy is crazy, where you have like 4 teams paying salaries they were 5 years ago, and then you've got like 6 teams paying the absolute bare minimum. And it feels like that's a problem.
Well, I think there's a couple of dynamics that have taken place that are kind of shaking out now, right? One is that equity was so easy for people to get for 5, 8 years in the space because it was growing so fast, that what developed was no one was trying to create content creator deals or player deals that could be actually economically viable. It was all about how do I grow revenue because I can then raise more equity based on that revenue growth, right? So there was a 99% focus on revenue growth and not on profitability, right? So that is the way that esports was run for quite a while. We had kept our powder dry and really hadn't spent that much money until we won in Reykjavik. And then it was like, okay, we now have an opportunity to close the gap on these organizations who've been around 5 years, 10 years longer than us, who've all spent tens of millions of dollars investing in their brand, right? And so there's a reasonable amount of information that's available publicly, right? But there's a lot of these organizations who've raised 30, 40, 50 million dollars, FaZe being the most obvious one, who raised 50 million from their SPAC. And so we had a window of time of saying, okay, we can now leapfrog a lot of these people. So we made that decision in 22. Obviously in 21, we made the most important decision we'd made when we exercised the option to acquire TenZ after Iceland. And so at that point, we're like, okay, we're now looking at the long term. We're looking at what can our brand be? Where can we stand as a brand in North America and in the world? And we then made a bet on ourselves that said we can build the most popular brand in North America. That is then what we set out to do. But like I said, a lot of these orgs had invested so much more than we had. So we then said, okay, we're going to go make this investment over the next 2 years to build the brand. And then we are going to really focus once we have the reach and the scale, right? Because it's hard when you have, at the time, if we had 100,000 Twitter followers and somebody else has 1 million Twitter followers and you're a brand, which brand are you going to pick to partner with, right? So we made a very conscious decision to invest in the brand and not to take smaller sponsor deals until we had reached critical mass. And so then we, unfortunately, right as we got to critical mass is when we ran into a recession. What's happening now, though, is there's a real adjustment being made in compensation across the industry where people now are being forced by their stakeholders to say, show me a business plan that can be profitable. And so that is the part of this. So I think you saw it happen this year because certainly the Americas was by far the highest paying region in VALORANT. But now you saw some rationalization of that this year. When you look at like buyouts, players were going for at the beginning of the partnership deals versus what happened this year in terms of, you know, I think Evil Geniuses was a little shocked of like, no, last year players were going from $250,000 to $500,000. We should be getting $500,000. What's going on? And so there was just a lot of those issues. And like I said, FaZe, their SPAC showed two things. One is, okay, there is a monetization path out there, right? Like they did generate over 50 million in revenue. The problem is they were putting together content deals and player deals that you couldn't possibly generate a profit from. And I think you're in the middle of that rationalization process. And then, like I said, with Riot, which other publishers have been doing, of now injecting the team capsule into the game that's really rewarding the people who've invested in their brand. So I think that combination, when you look at this in 2 years, I think that's when you'll start to say, okay, yes, 23, 24, it was a rough window of time for esports, but now you're getting to a place where it makes sense. You know, I laugh because we usually do an activation at the venue at Riot on match day, and a lot of college kids come up to me and say, is there really a future in esports? And I say to them, I go, well, none of you are old enough to have lived through the .com bubble. I said, but in 1999, there were all these companies worth billions of dollars because they would put the expression .com at the end of their name. And in the spring of 2020, 90% of those companies went away. But out of that came Amazon and Google and this whole generation of companies that everyone now knows is the most valuable companies in the world. I said, I don't know that that's where we're gonna end up on the upside, but in terms of going through that transition and going through that shakeout to where you now have a fraction of the orgs, but much more financially stable, I think that's the path esports is now on.
Wonderful. Well, it's been a great pleasure to chat, Rob. Any final words for the Sentinels fans that have supported the team through thick and thin?
Well, I think the funniest one was Tarek called me from his stream on Sunday, and it took me a moment to realize we were having the call on his stream. But I had sat in on his couch a couple of times where he was hosting events for our office, and it was always a joke with me and his chat that when we won, my iPad would suddenly light up. And so after we won, there were like 1,000 merchandise orders came through. My iPad was just melting down. But it has been fun in terms of the fans just showing back up and said, I've been here all along. And then, Riot announcing the performance of the team capsule and us being second. And I was laughing. I said, perfect, because now we have something still to accomplish. And then they announced, or yesterday it went live in the store where you can now, the team capsule is profiled in the store. So we just really appreciate how the fans have been on this ride with us and all having the opportunity to celebrate it together. I think the one key thing we talked about is it's a long season. And so it will be interesting to see how this first split goes, right? Because now the team, as opposed to last year where we competed the least, we've now competed the most in the world. But I think, they've shown what the upside is for this group.
Wonderful. Thanks all for watching. Bit of a different type of video today. If you enjoyed, hit the like button. We'll do more of these over in due course as well. Subscribe if you're new as always. Take care of yourselves. Thanks to Rob as always. And I'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.